All right, we're going to dive into our first ES6 feature, arrow functions. So, some quick information about arrow functions. An arrow function is a function expression which has shorter syntax compared to longer function expressions using the function keyword. One key difference is that it does not bind its own this, arguments, super, or new.target. Arrow functions are always anonymous, so they're especially good for like lambda functions or lambda expressions. The functions are best suited for non-method functions, as you can't use them for constructors. So here's some examples of arrow functions. So before we show all these examples, think for a second. You know what a normal function looks like in ES5. Here's an example. Function square takes a parameter a and returns a times a. So if you were on the standards body and you were asked to make this a little shorter, what could we reduce in terms of the syntax? One thing we could remove is the function keyword itself and have the functionality be implied by its syntax. We could also, if there was no other logic being performed, we could eliminate the return statement. We could eliminate braces in certain situations. So here are some examples of what ES6 arrow functions look like. So this first example here is a normal arrow function. It should be very familiar to everyone. Now if we took this function, or not an arrow function, but a normal ES5 function. So if we took that function and now turned it into an anonymous function and assigned it to a variable, it would look like this. Const square equals function a and returns a times a. Now we've got some syntax that we could eliminate and have that syntax be implied, or those keywords be implied, like the function keyword. All right, so what if we remove the function keyword and replace and insert into this function an arrow? And we have const square equals parameter list of a, arrow, brackets, and return a times a. Now if we reduce this even further, say we don't have other logic, we just want to immediately return a times a, we can do that with an implicit return function. So const square equals a, which is an arrow, so implicitly returning a times a. If there's only one parameter being passed into the function, we can eliminate the parentheses around the parameter list. And so this is our final and most compact version of the arrow function. So it's helpful to learn to be able to recognize different versions of these functions. They can be confusing if you're just starting and are not familiar with all the different variations. But I think it's helpful to develop what I call a spidey sense about functions, or a function sense, to be able to look at code and recognize some key patterns, and from that be able to immediately see what's a function. If you look at this example, what are some similarities? Each one of them has an arrow. Each one of them has either a parameter or a parameter list, or an empty parentheses for where a parameter would go. And there's something after the arrow. So that something could be an expression that's immediately evaluated and returned. It might be a block of code. It could be an object that's returned immediately. But it's helpful to develop a sense, I think, to be able to look at these functions and see them just by sight and recognize that these are arrow functions. So a helpful convention, if you're new to the syntax, something you can consider is always wrapping the parentheses, or always wrapping the parameter list in parentheses, and using a function body with an implicit return. So my recommendation would be to use the appropriate syntax for the situation, which sometimes is a very short arrow function, and sometimes is a long function with an explicit return. But if you're just learning this and you want to pick one style of syntax that will work everywhere, this is a style of syntax that will work anywhere. So you could adopt this as a convention until you're more familiar with the arrow syntax. Oh, an activity. So we have a few activities here. Just a quick note. So at the bottom of this activity, there's an activity plus. So activity pluses are a little harder, and they're designed to stretch and to help you grow. So we're going to do 3 activities. The first one, it says create a function which accepts a name and returns a greeting. So this would be a good time to pause and do that activity. Okay, I'm assuming you've unpaused, and I'll show what that might look like. So if we have a function which accepts a name and returns a greeting, we'll call this const greeting, which accepts a name and returns some sort of greeting. So our greeting here will be hello plus name. Now let's go ahead and call this. We'll open our console. Call this console.log greeting, and we'll pass to greeting Dave. All right, let's take a look at the second activity. It says a very common pattern is an arrow function which implicitly returns an object. Write an arrow function that accepts a single parameter name and returns an object representing a person. And let's use the implicit return of an object syntax. Go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, so we're going to write a function. We've written a function which accepts a parameter name and returns an object representing that person. Okay, so const, we'll call this person object. It takes a name, and we're going to do the implicit return. And so let's just take a second and look at what the syntax looks like. So if we have a function is normally wrapped in curly braces, right? Not normally, but a function, an object. Objects are always wrapped in curly braces. But if we want to implicitly return an object, so we return this curly braces, this is actually going to be interpreted as a function body, right? This is now the body of our function. If we'd like to have this not be evaluated as a function body, but implicitly returned as an object, we'll wrap that in parentheses like that. So we'll have our name is the name that was passed in, and we'll have just some other property just in order to demonstrate the concept here. Age is 30. And I'll go ahead and call this and see it in our console. So we'll say console.log person object with the name Dave. So there we see down here in the console, we've got an object with the age and the name property. All right, so let's look at the last activity now. Modify the greeting function to accept a generic greeting, like hello, and to return a function rather than a string. I'll say that again. So rather than returning a string, this function will return a function. The inner or returned function should accept a name as a parameter and then return the concatenated greeting with the name when it's called. I'll go ahead and pause the video and work on that. Okay, so we're going to work on this activity together. So we're going to create a generic greeting function which accepts a generic greeting and returns a function. So what does that look like? You know, at first actually it might be valuable to do this without ES6. So we'll say const greeting equals a function which accepts a greeting. We'll call it I don't want to have a confusing name here, so I'll call this our salutation function. So this function, it accepts a greeting and it returns a function itself. And this function accepts a name. And the inner function returns the greeting plus the name. So let's see what this looks like as we call it. So if we just log out salutation, we see that's our function. Now if we log out salutation but we call it with a greeting, we now see the return value of this function is the inner function itself. Right? What it's returned to us is a function, which means we can now interact with this whole block of code as a function. So we can put parentheses right on the end and pass in now our name. This is a technique commonly used in functional programming called currying, where you might have a function that accepts multiple properties, and you break that function down into single functions which return one function each, or have one parameter each and return functions until the final inner function is called. And this is useful further on in React and Redux particularly. We'll go into some use cases for this. So now that we've got this working, let's refactor our code and see what this might look like with ES6. I'll go ahead and put a console.clear there so you can clear the console every time the program runs. So we know that we can remove the function keyword and replace that with arrows. A little shorter. We also know that we can implicitly return things if we don't have to do any extra logic. So this inner one, let's take out the return and the curly brace and implicitly return the name and the greeting. And now we can do this with that outer function as well. We can implicitly return the inner function. Look how short this has now become. Additionally, we can remove these parentheses because there's only a single argument being passed in. So this functions precisely the same way, and look at how readable this is now. We have a salutation which accepts a greeting and then a name, and it returns a greeting and a name. And we know because this is a function, we can use our function Spidey Sense, that we could have this. We could do some cool things. For example, we could create a greeting called nice greeting, which equals a salutation of hello. And then we could call that. We could also create an angry greeting, which is a salutation of get lost. If this is a new concept, don't worry. We'll cover it more in depth later, but it's very useful in order to, particularly when you have bits of pieces of data at different times, you can configure these functions, and now you have functions which are returning functions that you can pass around to different contexts. So that is the end of this module. The next module is template literals.